Coming up this week, Alan G. Parker, documentary filmmaker of Borrowed Time, the story of John Lennon's last 10 years.
The more you study John Lennon, there's a degree of naivety right through his life. There's the famous story where he via Michael X, he writes a check for what he thinks is the peace cause in Northern Ireland. And then a few days later, someone at Apple says, you do realize that check probably paid for guns and bombs. I think if I'd have been doing this movie, say, even a decade ago, there may have been a possibility of it being slightly whitewashed. The psychic said, you will be something you will be shot on an island. I think it would probably be incredibly difficult for Lennon to operate where we are now.
And don't go away, that interview with Alan G. Parker about Lennon is coming up in a second. Please don't forget, subscribe, like, check out the other interviews at www.popthehistorymakers.com. Alan G. Parker, welcome. You're the director of Borrowed Time. It's a brilliant documentary. I was watching it last night, and it's about John Lennon's last decade. But first, I want to talk to you about the importance of music when you were growing up, what it meant to you.
Without sounding like you're over egging the pudding, for me, life-saving. Not life-changing, life-saving. I mean, I was born with a condition. It's bizarre. They give a dyslexic kid a condition he can neither spell nor say, which I believe is that the pronunciation is something like malacephia. Paris Hilton's latest child, as you've probably seen the photographs, has got it. It basically means big head, large skull. They call it double skull. The downside of it is that when I was born in 1965, I was about, as I began to grow, sort of 7, 8, 9 years old, I was about 4'1" or something initially, and probably about 4 stone 6 wet through with this head. So I looked like a bobblehead doll in a box on Blackpool seafront. Because of that, I was incredibly badly bullied, at junior school, and that went on to a degree to the start of secondary school, right? Dad was a music fan, was a big jazz fan, huge collection. So therefore, me and my brother became, I guess, music fans. We've talked about this a lot recently, me and our kid, and I think to a degree, probably sooner than most people would have been. By the time I had a newspaper round, going forward, that would have been 13, 14. I had the kind of record collection that 17-year-olds would have sold a kidney for, right? Because we get singles every week. We got albums at birthdays and Christmas. We had spending money. I wasn't going nowhere to spend it apart from the record store with my dad on a Saturday afternoon. So I initially was attracted by bands, I guess, like all my generation, like Slade and Sweet. The first twist comes when some of the girls at junior school are actually being, and also bear in mind that when I got home from school, I couldn't go nowhere because the kids who were bullying me predominantly lived in our area. So I wasn't out as much as the other kids. I was out a little bit, but generally in large gangs of people. And my dad and mum did get worried about it for a short time. A few of the girls became a little more receptive. So I was the kid who had the Marvel comics. I was the Spider-Man kid. I was the kid who, oddly enough, totally migrated to an American hero called Howard the Duck, based completely on the strapline on every issue of the comic, which is trapped in a world he never made. Right? I somehow found some kind of allegiance with that. And then how things changed dramatically, which is probably what makes Borrowed Time a more personal movie than the 14 that preceded it in my life, is a friend of my father's. Remember the old TDK 90 tapes? You could get an album on each side. Gave this to my dad and said, I think your boy will enjoy this. And dad brought it home. My mum told this story forever whenever there was more than 3 people gathered in a room, where I took the tape upstairs to my bedroom and I came downstairs. I'd have been 9 years old and I came downstairs crying. And she said, why are you crying? I said, there's a song on here they wrote for me. Side 1 had Rubber Soul on, side 2 had Revolver on. She said, play it. So I played it to them. It was Nowhere Man. I was convinced it was for me. That Christmas, which is only a matter of maybe 6 months or less later, my dad and mum bought me Sergeant Pepper. Well, you can imagine, I've already got this idea in my head at 9 that this guy's trying to get a message to me. We were born and raised in Blackburn, Lancashire. On goes Sergeant Pepper, and suddenly I read the news today. Oh boy, $4,000 in Blackburn, and I say, no, no, look, this guy's trying to get. I don't know who he is, but he's trying to get a message to me. Never mind the rest of the world. This is personal. And kids have sort of invisible friends or fantasy heroes. From about the age of 9 to arguably, I'd say probably at least the age of 20, John Lennon became the big brother I didn't have.
I mean, it's incredible because obviously that made you an outsider. I mean, being bullied at school, you are the outsider at school. And the outsider in pop culture often becomes the insider, the person that makes things and develops pop culture. Think Bowie, think Lennon, I suppose. It's all those things. So I think that connection is really fascinating. You fleetingly mentioned Sergeant Pepper, and you released the 50th anniversary film, the Sergeant Pepper anniversary in 2017.
Yes.
Was it then that the idea to do a film purely about Lennon came to you? And what was the original idea that you had in your head?
We did this Sergeant Pepper movie for the 50th anniversary. I'd always wanted to do a Beatles film for obvious reasons. And despite the huge success of, say, Monty Python or Status Quo or Who Killed Nancy, Apple never came a knocking. My name's not Martin Scorsese or Ron Howard or Peter Jackson. So the call never came. I thought you can probably make a very good backstory to Sergeant Pepper. You don't necessarily need. My theory was a simple one. It was, you're not making a movie about Frank Zappa's 26th album. So you don't need the music playing in the background to make it work. What you do need is all the backstories that made Sergeant Pepper possible, whether it's Epstein's death, LSD, introduction of Yoko, the Maharishi, all those things, right? We put the film out and it takes off like a rocket to the moon in like 2 minutes. So the plan was to do, I think, 2 nights in cinema. We were in cinema 3.5 months. Everywhere you went, everyone presumed, because the Beatles had their big Pepper 50th going on, that you were part of it. There's a very funny Sky TV breakfast interview where one of the ladies says, I've never seen a bigger advertising campaign for a documentary film in my life. What she didn't realize was she was seeing this £30 million plus Apple box set advertising campaign and putting 2 and 2 together and making 36. At the end of it, but when I say at the end of it, we have to think with the Pepper film, for example, we opened in the United Kingdom on the 26th of May, which was the 50th anniversary, 2017. But I was still doing press on the film in February 2018, because that's when we opened in Australia and Japan. So it's nearly a year of my life just making the film available to the world, About the summer of 2018, myself, my business partner, who's also my producer, line producer, business manager, all sit down and go, what next? And given the size of the film and given how much PR we'd had and everything, what next to me was so simplistic, it was unreal. As much as I wanted to get back onto doing official rock documentaries, I thought, right, so in December 2020, John Lennon will have been dead 40 years. So it's going to be a big anniversary. If we plan a movie that opens in cinemas on the 8th of December 2020, they say lightning can never strike anywhere twice. In this case, it can. So towards the end of 2018, we started a research period on the last decade. Bear in mind, at this point in time, what I knew about the proposed 1981 tour, I could sum up in one word: nothing, right? So we're going, in our own heads, we're going from around end of the Beatles to around assassination and or murder, depending whose camp you're in. The only rule really I had when I sat down with the whole team was, should anybody, and bear in mind a lot of these people I've known since I was 17, 18, that worked around the Beatles since I started going to Liverpool regularly, should anybody mention the name of that man with the gun, we turn the camera off, we pay him off, and they go home, because he's not going in my movie, right? I don't get breathing space. With that as an exception, anything else we can find out that's either untold or newish or if you like, puts a bit more light on a story we've all thought we knew, but then it turns out we didn't quite. Then that's the modus operandi for Borrowed Time. And oddly enough, unlike at least five of the movies that precede it, he'd had a title from day one. It wasn't like we're playing about with four or five possibilities. It was Borrowed Time. Once we knew we definitely missed our deadline, the plan was, well, why don't we just take as long as it takes and make the world's most informative John Lennon film? Because by now, not only people we knew we could rely on, like Tony Bramwell, Ray Conley, Philip Norman, etc., but people that we didn't think we had a hell's chance of getting near, like Tariq Ali, Tony Palmer, Jerry Cagle, they're coming to us. Oh, were you the Sergeant Pepper guy? Yeah. Oh, I've got some great John Lennon stories. Okay. So we end up, for the first time since Monty Python, and bear in mind that's 6 hours long, doing almost 60 interviews over the course of 2.5 years. To quote one of our investors, this has kind of been a movie that's been a bit stop, start, forget it, right? And then through no fault of anybody's, because of that, has ended up taking 5.5 years to get to where we are now, which is release day. And I don't know if anyone would ever cope with that psychologically, but we did.
You mentioned the planned 1981 tour. And there's an interview with Henry, brilliantly named Henry the Horse Smith, the tour manager.
Yes.
And we find out that John had mentioned he was in the process of getting Billy Graham to promote the tour. And Henry had said to him, "You don't need him, you're John Lennon." What do you think that said about John?
I think there's two things to take into consideration here. Number one, despite the fact that there's this huge gap from 1966 to 1980, where the Beatles or anybody else haven't toured, George Harrison toured quite extensively in the 70s. Paul, 70s and a big chunk of the 80s before coming back, how we know him now, in 89, 90. John hadn't toured. John had done a benefit gig here, a peace gig there. These weren't linked to any part of a tour. They were random shows. I don't think John did 7 solo shows all told from leaving the Beatles, right? Again, what John knew about touring, I can't remember if it's now in the director's cut or the short version, but where somebody says, John turned around and said, "I didn't even know how to switch a light on. Epi did all that," right? That was what they had Brian there for. What happened was, there was a friend of a friend who I got linked up to via Facebook. And I told him what we were doing. So by the way, we're already working. We've got this idea. We're going to make this film called Borrowed Time, Lennon's Last Decade. But we'll have to find a nice way out, because I don't really want it to end on 5 bullets. I want there to be a positive ending to it somehow. And he said, "Oh, so the 81 World Tour." And I went, I think I'd seen 2 lines on Google at that point, nothing more. I said, "Yeah, but you can't even Google it. There's nothing there." And he goes, "I was the journalist who was going to break the story." "You were? Come and sit here." And it was like, and who was going to be involved? This is Mark Cunningham. And Mark came with this story. And before I think I'd probably had 2 meetings with Mark, maybe 2 beers. And he said to me, "Okay, so they had a plan." He said, the guy that Mark used to work with at Britannia Row, had been out to New York in late 80, sat with John and Yoko, designed these amazing sets that I think U2 and Metallica were using 15 years later, bare minimum. Nothing like that was around in 1981 with cantilever arms and video screens everywhere. That was like state of the art and then some. That had all been pre-designed, and yet has been not necessarily ignored, but certainly hasn't been visual in any previous documentary, book, or anything at all. We're sat, I remember quite well, in an hotel room in New York when we're having this discussion with myself, Alexa, the producer, and Marguerite, the line producer, and we're going, hang on, we've got Earl Slick, who was lead guitar player. We've got John from the studio, who's going to be front of house sound. We've got Mark, who's going to break the story. Mark's put us on to this guy, Henry the Horse Smith, as named by Led Zeppelin. And Henry flies in, And we go for a curry with Henry the night before his interview, and Henry says, "Guys, how the hell do you know about this?" Everybody was under NDA. Nobody was told to say anything. And we pull out a brown envelope and we go, "Oh yeah, here's here's some of the stage sketch. You have the stage sketches. Where'd you get them from?" We go, "Well, we got a friend who, the poor guy who did the whole thing passed away, but his widow was very kind and said, no, I'd love the world to see what the plan was. So before you know where you are, we have this story. When one or two of the reviews on the Sergeant Pepper film, for example, which was about 2 hours on the nose long, especially the ones from the Beatle magazines and fanzines, tended to say, this film is fantastic. I learned quite a lot of the backstory of what the Beatles were up to in '67 from it. If anything, I'd have liked it to have been longer. So when I did finally get into edit, I sat with the editor and I said, look, we're under no pressure on this movie, really. We now have there's no anniversary to hit, there's no timeline to hit. We're just going for it. We're doing our own thing. My suggestion is that we make the world's longest John Lennon film. And then we send it out there with the sales guys. And if someone comes back and says, well, cut it in 4 and we'll take it as a TV series, or cut it in 3, then we're on board. We can do it. And he said, no, great idea. So we cut a movie, which bizarrely enough was 3 hours and 28 minutes long. And we sent it out. And the initial sales team said, everybody loves it, but everybody's also saying, how can we do this in cinemas with the director's Q&A to it? There's only going to be 2 screenings a day, tops. We like to do 5 screenings bare minimum to keep the lights on. Okay, so I said, well, what about a TV series? And then, we'll find another route to cinema. No, they want to go cinematic. Okay, so I think last August I was back in a studio slimming it down. And this is quite a funny story. I showed a friend of mine the original 328 version late summer last year in our apartment in London. And I said, and I knew he was a Beatles fan, a Lennon fan. I said, what do you think about that? I said, because we're about to press the delete version on that version at the studio because we've got this now sexy little 2 hour and 8 minute version that a lot of people are saying is way more accessible. And he looked at me, he said, you can't delete that. He said, I've just learned more about John Lennon watching that than I knew in the last 30 years. And I went, oh, okay. So I went back to the distributors and I said, here's an idea. Normally people release a movie and they put it out. And if it's a big success, about 5 or 10 years later on the anniversary, they bring out what they call a director's cut. Yes. Okay, imagine if the day we released, we had the movie plus a director's cut.
In terms of establishing, you establish the incredibly difficult childhood, having to choose between parents, and then, of course, his mother dying. And also, you establish, as you just said, the bigger than Jesus quote, and the meeting with Yoko Ono.
Yeah.
And what I found really fascinating about these things, by establishing those, you really deal with all of those later on as we go through the documentary. And in addition to that, and you've already mentioned Tariq Ali, and we hear about John's activism. Now we're hearing it. I mean, people my age are obviously going to be very close to this movie, but I feel that a lot of younger people are going to watch this movie. And this is something that was so unique about this character. Do you feel he was naive and just good intention, or was there much more to what he was doing with his activism?
I think with the activism, there's a degree of now. I mean, there's the famous story where he via Michael X, he writes a check for what he thinks is the peace cause in Northern Ireland, and then a few days later, someone at Apple says, "You do realise that check probably paid for guns and bombs." I think there's a degree of naivety in it. I think there's a degree of, the more you study John Lennon, there's a degree of naivety right through his life that almost in another world doesn't seem to affect Paul McCartney. Maybe it's they dealt with fame easier. I don't know. Maybe there was something about that. I wasn't sure initially how far back we were going to go. And what was brilliant was that when, as you know, because the Jesus Christ thing was such a huge story at the time, when you go back and look at all the different press conferences and news interviews, you don't have one or two to choose from. You've got about 19 different stations in America alone, right? So in one of the apologies, someone says to him, "How's your father?" Because there'd been an article in the British press that his father had made contact. And John, of course, gives, for a film director, gives us this delicious answer, which is, "I don't know my father. He vanished when I was 4 or 5, and he came back with his cap out when I had some money, you know." And I thought, that's just told me more than I needed to know about the missing years that we didn't cover, right? Then we were lucky in that we had this amazing American TV interview from 71, where John and Yoko are sat talking to a journalist, which hasn't been used in a previous Beatles documentary, and where John says, all I knew that he was on the ship. So every time I was on the seafront in Liverpool and saw a liner, I thought, there's my dad. We didn't know him, didn't know the guy. Um, I think where we've been incredibly lucky is that a lot of the people that we did get on camera, with the exception of 4 or 5 incredibly good journalists who I think you always need, because what you tend to find it when no matter what you make a documentary about is that no matter how well someone knew somebody, a lot of these older guys who were around them at the time, their memory for dates and years is almost nada. You go, that happened, but it could have happened in 66. It might have been 68. Well, no, these guys, you bring in your Mojo guys and your Uncut and your Q and your Record Collection and wherever else, and they go, oh no, it was the 3rd of January 1978, and John wore green socks, right? You go, you're my guy. You come in, you'll do for that detail. And we had 2 or 3 belters on there, just to name check. You've got Kenneth Womack, Pat Gilbert, Matt Snow. I can't say enough about, because they dotted every I and crossed every T between them. But what was interesting is that occasionally you would get something where, obviously, no matter how many newspapers and books you read, it's that John's going on all these peace marches in London or wherever else in Europe or whatever. Then you have Tariq Ali, who marched side by side with the man in the Red Mall days, and Tariq says, even IRA marches. And I think the naivety there is that because there was all these protests going on in London, especially in 68, 69, 70, John probably was the kind of guy who saw a protest and went, get a placard together, we'll be with them in 20 minutes, right? Let's go and, power to the people, as it were, There's a great story of Tariq's, which I'm fairly sure made the director's cut, but not the shorter cut, where Tariq says, he'd spoken to John on the telephone a few years later about the file the FBI had on John, which, considering it's a musician, is quite a thing. I've had it on my knee on 2 airline journeys. It's like that. Okay, a lot of it is now redacted in jet black ink and will be made public about 145 years after all of us knew John Lennon are long dead, for obvious reasons. But Tariq later found out, I think it was something like 21 or 20, that the file they had on him down at Vauxhall there in England was in about 7 rooms. It just was forever. So from Tariq you're getting the unfiltered version of I walked a mile in, as Elvis would say, walk a mile in my shoes. Well, I think Tariq walked 25 miles in John's shoes over the years and, knew where he was coming from. The other thing as well that I'm very proud of is I must have in the other room there an absolute library of Beatles books, almost all of which say, for example, the first time Yoko attended a recording session was the White Album. In the late part of 2023, at Getty, we found a photograph of Yoko at the Magical Mystery Tour sessions. That picture hadn't been used anywhere before. And I'm going, how's anybody missed that? It's like flashing at me like a green light for go. And okay, we're going to take that. Of course we are. We've already had 2 or 3 reviews. And I have to say, from reading a couple of the reviews, there are people who genuinely get it. They're going, I sat down, I watched this movie, and all the way through the movie, these might not be earth-shattering stories, but there's more arriving to the story of John Lennon and the Beatles than we've had in 50 years. You know, little twists here and there. That happened in June. No, it happened in September. They first, you know, she first attended a session was White Album. No, it was Mystery Tour. That predates White Album by 12 months.
But
So
isn't that partly because, you know, Lennon is a mythic figure really now, and the problem with figures that are mythic that we sometimes don't see their flaws, or we've covered up their flaws, or we've, you know, made them look a bit better in a way. So, you know, and in this documentary, you do sort of, in a way, explode some of the myths, you know, the myth of the house husband, the lost weekend myths, and things like that, which is fantastic because you know, I was like, wow.
I'll be honest, one of the things I had to be very, very careful with, and Alexa Morris is, you know, my business partner, Margarita Doyle is our line producer, again, two guys who must be named here, Edwin Philpott, our business manager, Alan Partington, our sales manager. The one thing that I'm very proud and glad they were there for is there is a tendency when you're me, and when it means, you know, tattoo, when it means that much to you, that you start assembling it and you start only looking for good stuff because you don't want to sling any mud at it. And then there were conversations over the course of at least a couple of years of different edits that went, by telling the truth, you're not slinging any mud at it. You know, I'm the kind of guy who quite honestly was, you know, as always, wore my heart on my sleeve. And if anything comes along that majorly upsets me, I'm also the kind of guy who's straight into therapy for about 3 months, right? Because sometimes the old ghosts are still lurking under the surface. However, when it came to doing the two cuts, whether it's directors or the new cinema TV version, the reality had to be that I couldn't put John in a white suit on a white horse because that wouldn't be being fair to any audience, whether it be the rabid audience who've been waiting for this thing now for about 3 years since we put the very first press release out, or the audience who maybe own just the red one and blue one and probably won't see it till it's on some free TV channel like next January, right? But either of those audiences need to see the reality.
Before we get on with that interview with Alan G. Parker about Borrowed Time, just time for me to ask you to please like, subscribe, and check out other interviews at www.popthehistorymakers.com.
You mentioned the Lost Weekend. I mean, you know, for 50 years plus, the version we've heard is the version where they're not getting on too well. And Yoko says, here's the secretary, go and have an affair, right? I've been in some very long-winded relationships in my life with various women, 7 years here, 8 years there. I've never met a woman so generous that she said, things aren't going too well. Have you met my cousin? You know, whatever it might be, right? And I thought there's got to be a real story to this, right? The wife doesn't normally say, there's the affair, right? We started talking to people who knew John incredibly well. And suddenly this story comes out that, yes, John has been cheating. One of the one of these things is well documented. It was at a party. It's in various Lennon documentaries. Yoko goes to Chicago to do a woman's peace protest speech. Almost the minute she leaves, John packs 2 bags, grabs Pang and books 2 tickets that way to LA. That's never set up by Yoko. It's just something he does. But as you know, the incredible Ray Conley, who I do love, and Ray is such a anchored to the ground guy, not only a great journalist, but an incredibly truthful man in the way he looks at the world. I think there's about 4 occasions in the director's cut, and at least 2 or 3 in the shorter cut, where Ray says, what I couldn't understand is this very tuned in, very real man, very living in the now man, who when he went back to Yoko, almost agreed with everybody, just almost agreed with everything, that was said, just to keep the party line straight. You know, oh yes, she set the affair up. Yes, she's the greatest thing that's ever happened. Yes, she co-wrote blah, blah. May not all be true. May not all be true, you know. And so I don't see anything wrong in, I wouldn't say exposing that, because I think that makes it too grandiose a statement. I think all we've done is try and be honest.
Yeah, no, I felt there was one question in it that I felt was so brutally honest, and it was about what John's choices did to Julian.
Yeah. I mean, Julian, I think, I mean, there's nothing in there, I guess, that Julian hasn't said himself 100 times in interviews. The reality is, occasionally John would go, "This is a great idea," and not remember the fact that way back at the beginning of Beatlemania, he had a child, and that child was growing up and was still there. I think Ray's line is probably the best one in the movie when he says, "This was a neglected child who lost his father not to a drug overdose, but to the fact that he was gunned down in the street just when he was getting to know him." No, as a human being, forget rock and roll or being a fan of anything. I don't think Julian was dealt the best set of cards in the world, but I think that looking at who he has become, it may have been what it took to strengthen him. You know, I believe that whatever strength there is in Alan Parker came largely about through that beginning, through that being bullied in the schoolyard, through that having to face up to every level of adversity that they can throw at you. You do suddenly form an outer shell where you go, okay, I understand you, and you are good people. The rest of you, bye, gone. And it's that simple.
It's about, in a sense, the artist's journey. I mean, I had an absent father emotionally and then later physically, and I've been dealing with that my whole life.
Yeah.
And what I do is trying to compensate it, and the artist will compensate that with their art.
Yeah. I think, John's a complex character, that's for sure. The bit where and again, this is something I picked up on in a couple of the Sergeant Pepper reviews I read, where people would say, oh, there was a story there, whatever it was about. I think one of the stories was about the end of Brian Epstein's life. And the reviewers said, had this been an official Apple documentary, they'd never have got that through the doors in 100 years. So yes, I admit there's a huge downside to making an unofficial documentary about an icon. A, you don't necessarily have access to the music. B, there's certain film archive clips you could do with, but you haven't got. But C, much more importantly, from the point of view of a creative person, is nobody is standing behind you saying you can't do that. Yeah. Everything's about how you feel and how it's going to go forward,
and also the exploration of stories. I mean, there's one story there, and I went into the net immediately because I'm in Athens in Greece. And, and of course it hit me, oh my God, John and Yoko saw a psychic in Greece.
Oh, yeah.
10 years before he died on one of the islands. First of all, tell me what the psychic said.
The psychic said, you will be shot on an island. Now, the first chill that goes up your back is, what's Manhattan if it's not an island? Right? I'd never heard that story before. That story came from a very esteemed writer, a guy called Terry Rawlings, who's written some amazing books on everyone from Brian Jones to the Beatles themselves. The way it came over from Terry was almost like you talk to a friend in a pub. It was told in almost conversational style. And when we got it in the edit suite, we realized that having done a little bit more digging, there was a tiny bit more to it than the way he presented it. So we thought, right, well, the best way to do it is to put it together as a montage, right, where you're able to have the only existing photograph of John and Yoko in Greece with Magic Alex. Believe me, we combed the world. There's one photograph that still exists. That's the one in the movie. Also, the tarot cards being dealt, which I thought was a great idea because that's what it was all about. And then a few other bits and bobs going on with music and things. But it's very interesting that should happen. And it's a very strange backstory because, again, I don't remember reading it anywhere. If it is in a book, it's escaped me, right? And or seeing it in a documentary, but it's a perfectly true story, There are a few things like that. I mean, there's a great line in the movie from Chris Salowitz, the journalist, who again has written some amazing books on everything from Joe Strummer to Jimmy Page. And he's an amazing writer and a great raconteur. And he says, I was so pleased when he said it because by the time we interviewed Chris, we'd done over 25 interviews. And he just suddenly, in the middle of a statement, he said, he just looked at me and he winked and he went, working class hero, John? Not really. And I thought, you're dead right. You've got to take away. I think if I'd have been doing this movie, say, even a decade ago, there may have been a possibility of it being slightly whitewashed, of it being a little bit like we can't put too much in that sounds like it's negative. But as you just said yourself, if you sit down and watch it as a full piece, which is now what it is, 2 hours, 8 minutes, I don't think it comes across remotely negative. It comes across as this is John Lennon.
It humanizes him.
If you end up not liking bits of it, there's precious little we can do to change the history of a man who died 45 years ago, but it is what it is, and that's kind of, yeah.
I mean, obviously, towards the end of the movie, you're covering, his untimely murder, and you're talking to people who had interviewed him, and there are some, just. I mean, I did know about the Andy Peebles thing, obviously, that, he'd asked him about personal security.
Yes.
And John had said.
Basically, John had said, you don't need it. This is a city where I walk around free. People say, hi, John, how's the baby? How's life? It's very, if you think about it, at the time, when you go back and listen to those two interviews he did, there's the Andy Peebles one and the Dave Sholin one, which were literally 24 hours apart, right? The last two interviews he would ever do. Oddly enough, given the size of the story was, not short interviews either. They're both 3 or 4 hours long, in their entirety. And you've never heard him sounding happier. He sounds like he's got more to live for than me, you, and the next 500 people through the door. And yet within 24 hours, he's going to be gone. And in a really senseless way as well. Didn't get run down by a bus or, it's not good, and so at the beginning, there was kind of all sorts of, conversations within the group, the Geezer and Blonde Productions team, which was like, how much time do we spend on that? Everyone knows about it. We don't want to labor it. So very early on in the production, I'd said to the team, we only go for as much as there is something new to talk about. If it's all going to be the same old, I met John and 12 hours later he got shot 5 times, I'm not interested. Where it became incredibly good was the production of 2 people. One was Jerry Cagle, who was effectively Dave Shalon's boss, who, although he knew John Lennon very well for 7 years and was very close to John Lennon for 7 years, had never granted an interview to any interview team at all anywhere around the world for 44 years because he didn't think his story was important. And we got him while we were in Los Angeles via Dave. The first time one of our team approached him, he said, no, I don't do those interviews. Apparently, he then told his daughter the following evening, who'd said to him, but Dad, you're getting older. One day your grandchildren will never know you knew John Lennon very well. What about something for their legacy? Jerry obviously took heed of the call and rang us back the next morning and said, okay, I'm told by Dave Sholin, this guy's a nice guy. I'll do the interview. And what we got from him was gold from start to finish. I don't know if there's a minute of Jerry's interview that wasn't usable in some way or another. It was amazing. The other thing that was interesting was this eyewitness guy, the painter. Now, I'd known about the painting as a Lennon fan for years, but I'd never, and this is the funniest story you'll probably ever hear for the rest of your life. We're sat in a room, about 6 of us, trying to find certain people, right? Some people are easy to get to. They've got a website or they've got an agent or they've got a manager. And we're trying to find this guy and all roads are leading to nowhere. I go for a coffee with a friend of a friend in a very well-known rock and roll hotel in central London. And we're sat chatting and I go, yeah, this guy, who's probably in his 80s by now, because he was John's age, and he was a painter, oil on canvas guy, and diddle-a-diddle-a-da. And this guy, one of the guys around the table says, oh, yes, Andy's dog who is called blah, blah. And I go, sorry? Yeah, he lives in Venice. He lives where? You know him? No, but I know a guy who does know him. He lives in Venice. He lives on one of the canals in Venice. He's right next to the canal. Long. Can you get to him? I think it was 6 hours later that he's on the phone to our line producer. And they had a hour-long conversation, Oh, yes, I was there. I lived in the building across the road. There's a 12th floor down view from way high up. I heard the first gunshot. I was sat in the bay window by the second gunshot, and I sat there for 6 hours and watched it all unfold. And so we go to Venice to interview him. And while we're with him, he says to me, "Would you like to get my eye view?" I go, "How do we do that?" Well, this is bearing in mind 40 odd years earlier. Well, when I left the flat, I sold it to my best friend, and he's still there. I nearly kissed him. I'm like, this is going to change everything, because not only are we getting your viewpoint, we're getting it from your viewpoint. You
That's
know,
amazing.
one of the stories about two interviewees had said to us, which we used in the opening titles, is because it didn't work in the movie, is every morning in that retirement period, so-called retirement period, John would get up, make a coffee, sit in the window and look over Central Park. And I go, how do we get John's eye view? Did anyone ever take any film? Is there a still photograph? No. We're in the friend's flat doing the 12th floor look down to Dakota Arch, and his wife comes through and says to me, "Alan, you might want to follow me a minute." So she takes me through this hallway down to the master bedroom. We go in the master bedroom and she goes, "Look over there." And the windows are open in John and Yoko's apartment. There's a white piano. She goes, "That's the white piano." And I go, "Wow." And she goes, "Come here." And I go to the window that looks over Central Park, and she goes, "There's John's eye view." And I go, "Are you kidding me?" "No, that's the exact same eye view as the flat across, which is John and Yoko's over there." So I go back to the crew who were busy filming downwards, and I go, "Guys, when you've finished, follow me. We got another shot in this building." We just kept getting these bits of luck, and there's a funny story I must tell you, because I've been mentioning this to a few journalists. Many years ago, Julian did an interview where he said that his father had said to him, "When I'm gone, if ever I need to get a message to you, I'll send a white feather." Some native tribe came to see Julian about some charity work. They came to the foyer of an hotel. They present him with a big white feather. He can't believe it, right? He's walking through a park one day and a white feather falls out of a tree. As you can imagine, for a director, when a project lasts as long as this one's lasted, there comes time, even if it's only your own personal life that's playing a part in this, where you become a little bit jaded by it all, where you become a little bit unhappy about it all, or you feel as though you should have more control of a situation or whatever. I've finished filming, but I can't get into a studio for 4 months. Well, that's a big gap, and I really want the world to see this movie. And on two occasions throughout the 5.5 years, once was walking up Sunset Strip with our gaffer on a day off, and out of nowhere, a white feather fell out of a tree, and we looked at each other and went, "What?" And then the second time, I'm in the middle of Soho on the phone to my line producer, and a white feather fell off a roof. And that was the day when I was saying something to the words of, "Oh, sod John Lennon, I wish we'd never started this movie."
One thing, I've interviewed Laurie Kay before, and you mentioned Dave Sholin, and they did that interview together. And for me, and this comes across not only from her interview before, but from definitely in your movie, is that you have the feeling that there is survivor's guilt from the people that interviewed him towards the end. Did
Yeah.
you have that feeling from them?
I think where the problem lies in that context is that when both film crews turned or interview crews turned up at the Dakota building, which they did initially, even though in the case of Andy Peebles, the interview was done elsewhere, they would have turned up to a Dakota building, which we've seen in many drama movies about the subject, which at any one given time of the day would have had anywhere between 8 and 25 people hanging around the gate, either trying to get a photograph, trying to get something signed. Some days it was even less. I remember talking to a doorman who worked there. He said one day, which was quite a cold day, there was only 3 people there. What I think is difficult, which would be very difficult for me to take on board as well, is in the case of the two interview crews, one of those people was he who shall not be named. And they walked right past him going in, and they walked right past him coming out again. Now, in the case of Andy Peebles and his team, there was no actual verbal interaction. It was just, he looks a bit odd. Why, everybody else is wearing a John Lennon badge or they've got a flower in their rosette. He's wearing a big overcoat and a big fur hat, even though it's, I think, the mildest winter New York had ever had, December of 80, right? And they walk past him in and out. When the American team leave and they're going their separate ways, the female member of the team is going off to dinner. She's not going with the rest of them back to San Francisco, and there's a conversation that takes place. And from what it sounds, not a nice conversation either. Quite an angry conversation. Did you see him? What did he say? Did he do? Some guy who's got way too many questions for a bloke on the sidewalk, right? But the point of the matter is, and I think especially in the 21st century as we live now, certainly after things like, 9/11, the London bombings, various things that have happened in our lifetimes, is if you started feeling worried about every random person you met on the street, I doubt you'd get further than the end of your road every morning, right? So I guess there must be a degree of survivor's guilt within them. But the question, I guess, really is what could they have done anyway, right? You don't know that guy has got a gun in his pocket. You don't know what's going to happen in the next few hours. So I can see to a degree why they may feel that way. But in my book, they should all be completely vindicated because I don't think there's anything they could have done to change what was about to happen.
One of the most amazing things at the end, and I didn't know, I mean, I knew he'd broken the news, but I didn't know that Alan Weiss's story of breaking the news, and it's just so compelling.
Mm. It's quite funny. There's two interviews in the movie. One of them, unfortunately, had to fall by the wayside because it's in the director's version. But they were two what I call standalone interviews. So whereas normally when you're doing a documentary, you'll have two or three people talking about the same story, interwoven with archive or stills or music or some interview clips with John himself. There were two stories that depended 100% on one person because nobody else was there to share the story. One of them, which is in the director's cut, was a story from John's lawyer, who now lives up in the mountains of North Carolina, Jay, and that was a story about John almost unwittingly being involved in the Five Families in the Mafia due to a bootleg album that was going to be TV sold, and that's quite an interesting story. But it's almost 10 minutes on its own with predominantly one guy telling the story, who tells it well because it's his job. He's a lawyer. He can tell a good story. And it's got stills in it and blah, blah. When we cut Alan Weiss's story the first time, because he's a TV journalist and obviously has been doing this since, as I usually say, Moses parted the Red Sea, and is predominantly brilliant at it, he told it very well. But the original version we cut in the director's cut, I think, is about 12 minutes long. When we came to shortening it for easier access for everybody, we sort of sat there, looked at each other and went, this story is amazing, but it's too long. What can we do with it that will make it breathe a bit simpler? Well, we need to keep all the major parts of it, especially the bit about the doctor saying you cannot use that phone and him giving her a reason why he should use the phone. And then someone said, well, why don't we bring in things like, footage of say, an ambulance racing through the city or a gurney being pushed down just archive footage of hospitals, basically, which will help it breathe a little bit. It's an incredible story that he was there. It's an incredible thing that he was in the hospital that night. But what's even more incredible is that he was able to break the story hours before any other news team was near it. There's a lot of things that went on in that hospital that night. As I say, the longer version is in the director's cut, but the truncated version is basically that he managed to talk a doctor into understanding this was his passion to be the best journalist there was. And if her passion had not been to be the best surgeon she could be, then why would she not let him have his own dream as well? And I think it's an amazing story, really good story.
No, it's just fascinating. I've just got one last question, because what do you think it says about today and about the power of music today as opposed to, back then? that we no longer have a figure like Lennon?
I think it would probably be incredibly difficult for a Lennon to operate where we are now, for example. Could you imagine John Lennon being silent about what Donald Trump's doing right now? I couldn't. I imagine he would be on the cover of every newspaper and or magazine that would have him right now, talking up about what's going on over there, you know? Could you imagine John Lennon being silent about what Musk is doing to social media? Because I can't. I just think John Lennon would be the first in line to be banging the drum about all that for sure. So I think it probably, you know, there was a time in the late 80s and early 90s when certain pop stars became a little bit more political again. But it almost seems, without naming any names, because I think you probably know whom I'm talking about, two or three of them, as soon as anything got what looked like remotely too dangerous, they sort of went almost to the edge of the pier and then came back. John seemed to almost go to the end of the pier and then launch the lifeboat. You know, it's like on it goes. And I don't think, you know, one of the interviewees, again, this is something that didn't need to make the cut. When I said to them all, what do you think John would be doing now? And the common answer was either retired, playing seasons in Vegas like they all do, or doing like Paul and putting an album out now and then touring almost every year that he can do, right? Only about one or two people said probably retired from music and completely involved in politics. Now, obviously we'll never know whether that would be the case. You know, there are dozens and dozens, as you know, of very studied and well-researched hardback books written by ex-lawyers and you know, conspiracy theorists and God knows who else, that the killer was trained by the CIA or FBI, and the reason they were dum-dum bullets when you couldn't buy them is because they were supplied by the government. Reagan was about to come in. Lennon was becoming politically active again. That wasn't good for him. All those things that we'll never, whether they're true or false, we'll never know. The fact that the FBI file is mainly redacted means we'll never know in our lifetimes anyway what the reality was. But I think John Lennon was definitely a man who, I don't think he would have been easy to gag, shall we put it that way? Not at all.
Well, Alan G. Parker, thank you. And thank you for putting such wonderful creativity out into the world. And maybe we have to thank your bullies, because I think in some way your childhood has really, you know, given you the drive to become, you know, such a sort of creative genius. And I thoroughly enjoyed the film. It's called Borrowed Time. And yeah, I can't recommend it highly enough. Alan G. Parker, thank you.
Thanks for having me, man. Thank you for everything. And I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.